The sun had barely kissed the horizon when Michelle pulled into her driveway, her car tires screeching against the wet pavement as though it, too, was anxious to know what awaited inside. The house seemed too quiet, too still. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee and fresh sheets that had once comforted her now felt like a reminder of everything she had lost. Her gaze immediately shifted to the living room window, where she could just make out the soft, loyal silhouette of Boomer, her German shepherd, sitting quietly by the door. A lump formed in her throat and she couldn't breathe. Something was wrong. She rushed inside, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. Every step louder than the last as she passed the hallway that led to the nursery. It was there, the sound that had haunted her for days, the absence of her baby's laugh, the silence too thick for comfort. She pushed open the door, her breath shallow and frantic, only to stop in her tracks. Boomer stood at the foot of the crib, covered in blood. His fur was matted and soaked, the once proud dog now trembling like a leaf in a storm. She dropped to her knees, horror squeezing her chest. Her heart raced as she glanced from the dog to the crib, praying, hoping against everything she knew to find her daughter, Ava, safe and sound. But when her eyes locked onto the crib, her world shattered. Your support keeps us going. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The house smelled faintly of pine, scented candles, and wet rain. The sky was grey, a soft drizzle falling as Michelle walked into the living room, glancing over her shoulder toward the nursery. Boomer, her German shepherd, was sitting by the door as usual, but something about him was different. His tail hung low, and his eyes, something about them felt strange. She shook it off, distracted by the hum of her thoughts as she called out for her daughter. But as she stepped closer to the nursery, the soft, familiar sound of baby coos that had filled the room every time she passed the door was missing. There was silence. Complete, absolute silence. Panic prickled her skin. She shoved open the door. Boomer stood there staring at her with wide, fearful eyes. His fur was drenched in blood. Michelle froze, a cold shock running through her veins. But then her gaze immediately shifted to the crib. Ava wasn't there. She rushed to the crib, her heart in her throat, her chest tight with fear. The blood. It wasn't Ava's. Her mind screamed, and she felt the world begin to fracture around her. But then, there, at the edge of the bathroom door, she heard a faint whimper. Her voice cracked, desperate and raw. Boomer's tail wagged, hesitant. He followed her quietly. But there was something different about him now. He wasn't just the dog she knew. He had become something else. Something much, much more. She pushed open the door to the bathroom and found her daughter huddled, clutching the dog's fur tightly, trembling but unharmed. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she rushed to scoop Ava up, clutching her close, trembling. Boomer followed quietly, now calm but still watchful. Michelle's mind raced as she processed what had happened, and it came to her all at once. Boomer had saved her. He had protected Ava from someone else, from a threat she hadn't seen coming. Later, the police would find the man, a stranger who had trespassed into their home, intent on doing something unspeakable. But in the end, it didn't matter. Boomer had kept them safe. Michelle couldn't hold back the tears anymore. She cradled Ava tightly, resting her cheek on the soft head of her daughter as Boomer lay at their feet, the three of them together, now more than just a family. They were a fortress, bound together by an unspoken bond that could never be broken. The early mornings had always been Michelle's time for solitude, a quiet breath before the chaotic rhythm of the day began. As the sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors, she lingered in the kitchen, savoring the ritual of brewing coffee. The smell of freshly ground beans filled the air, a comfort that had grounded her through the months of new motherhood. Ava, her baby girl, still slept in the nursery, wrapped in the soft folds of blankets, her tiny breaths rising and falling like a steady rhythm of peace. Boomer, her ever faithful German shepherd, lay by the back door, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but always alert. He had been with Michelle since the first days of her adult life, a constant companion through heartache, joy, and every quiet moment in between. His loyalty was unwavering, and in return, Michelle had come to trust him with her life, and now, with her most precious treasure, her daughter. The bond between Boomer and Ava was palpable. He was always near, a shadow that followed her tiny hands as they grasped for the world around her. Boomer was the protector. His presence, so big, so imposing, had always been a source of comfort to Michelle. She never once questioned his loyalty, never once feared that anything could harm her daughter as long as he was there. He had always been gentle, his instincts sharp but never aggressive. That morning, Michelle had a strange feeling. A quiet hum in the air, something unspoken between them all. She could feel Boomer's eyes on her as she kissed Ava's forehead, whispering a soft goodbye as she prepared to leave for work. But something about the dog's gaze unsettled her. The way he followed her with his eyes, his tail still, made her hesitate. "Everything's fine, Boomer," she said softly, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. He leaned into her touch, but she could feel the tremor in his body, the slight twitch of his muscles that was unlike him. She told herself it was nothing. He was probably just tired, maybe a little anxious. But there was a faint unease in the pit of her stomach as she left the house. The world outside was crisp and alive. The cool morning air felt like a new beginning, and Michelle allowed herself to breathe deeply, soaking in the rare sense of peace. She let her mind wander to the simple joys of her job at the local cafe. The warm steam of the espresso machine, the hum of friendly chatter, the smile of a regular customer. It was a comfortable routine, a life she had built from the ground up. But as she pulled into the parking lot, something changed. Her phone buzzed with a message from her neighbor, something innocuous, but as she read the words, a knot tightened in her chest. It was nothing, she told herself. She was just being paranoid. Still, the feeling lingered. She couldn't shake the sense that today would be different, and she had no idea how right she was. Michelle's heart pounded in her chest as she entered the house, the sound of her footsteps too loud in the oppressive silence. The rain had begun to fall, its steady tapping on the windows echoing the rhythm of her growing unease. She called out for Boomer, her voice slightly too sharp, too anxious, but there was no response. The house was eerily quiet. Ava's coos, her laughter, the familiar sounds of her baby's presence, were missing. The weight of that silence pressed down on Michelle, making her pulse race. She rushed to the nursery, her hands shaking as she reached for the doorknob. Inside, Boomer was standing still by the crib, his body rigid, his coat matted with something dark. Blood. Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen for a moment, unwilling to believe what her eyes were showing her. She blinked hard, hoping for some clarity, but the image remained. Boomer covered in blood. "Boomer," Michelle whispered, her voice breaking. She stepped forward, her heart pounding as she reached for the dog. He didn't move. His eyes were wide, but they held something she hadn't seen before. Guilt or fear. Her mind raced, her thoughts spinning faster than she could process. She didn't even dare to glance at the crib, not yet. "Where's Ava?" She managed to choke out, her voice thin, trembling with the weight of her fear. Boomer's tail twitched, but he didn't respond. He was still motionless, not like the dog she knew, the dog who had always been so full of life, of movement. This was different. His eyes met hers, and Michelle swore she saw something in them, something too knowing for a dog. Then she turned her gaze toward the crib. Ava's crib empty, her breath caught. Her entire world seemed to crumble in that moment, but the realization that followed was even more terrifying. The blood was not Ava's. The sight before her wasn't the nightmare of a dead child. It was something else, something worse. Where was her baby? Michelle moved with a kind of frantic determination that could only come from the raw fear of not knowing what had happened to her child. She called for Ava, her voice shaking, her heart hammering as she scanned the room, then the hallway, then the house itself. There was no sign of her daughter. Her mind raced, picturing every scenario, each more horrific than the last. What if someone had broken in? What if something terrible had happened while she wasn't there? The room seemed to close in around her, the walls suffocating her, and her breath quickened as she turned, searching every corner for her baby. "Boomer, where is she?" Michelle pleaded, her voice cracking. The dog stood motionless in the hallway, his eyes never leaving her. It was as if he understood what she was asking, but his silence only made the tension in her chest rise. Then she heard it. A faint sound, muffled but unmistakable. A soft cry. Her heart leaped, her feet moving faster than she thought possible as she followed the sound. In the bathroom, huddled on the cold tiles, was Ava. She was clutching onto Boomer's fur, her face streaked with tears, her tiny body trembling in the dark. Michelle's body shook with relief. She reached down and scooped Ava up, holding her tight as she buried her face in her daughter's hair. The tears came then, hot and uncontrollable. "It's okay, sweetheart," Michelle whispered, rocking her gently. "It's okay. Mommy's here." Boomer stood by the door, watching, his body still tense but his gaze softer. He had saved Ava, and somehow Michelle knew it. But there were still questions, things she didn't understand. Why had Boomer been covered in blood? Why had he been so still, so calm when everything else around them was chaos? As she held Ava close, she whispered a promise to herself. She would figure this out. She would get to the bottom of what had happened, no matter the cost. It didn't take long for the pieces to start falling into place. Michelle spent the rest of the day replaying every moment, every detail. Her thoughts circled around Boomer and his strange behavior leading up to the event. His sudden anxiety, his restless pacing, the way he had been groveling at seemingly nothing. Michelle had been so caught up in the normal chaos of her day-to-day life that she hadn't stopped to notice the subtle shifts in Boomer's behavior. She had missed the signs. The blood on him hadn't been Ava's. It had been from a man, a trespasser. Michelle couldn't fathom the implications. The thought sent a wave of cold through her veins. Someone had entered their home, but Boomer had stopped them. Had he known something she didn't? Had he sensed danger before she could? Boomer's actions had been deliberate, protective. He had guarded Ava from someone dangerous. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Boomer had saved their lives. As Michelle thought back to the morning, she realized the guilt that had clouded Boomer's eyes wasn't his own. It was the weight of the responsibility he had carried, the burden of protecting his family, even at the risk of his own well-being. Boomer wasn't just a dog, he was more than that. He had become the protector, the guardian of their peace. Michelle had always trusted him, but now she saw him as the unsung hero. The aftermath was a blur. Police reports, questions, the shock of it all. But in the midst of the chaos, Michelle found clarity. Boomer wasn't just her dog, he was family. The man was found unconscious outside, a trespasser with no name, no explanation. The police offered to press charges, but Michelle didn't care. She had her daughter, and she had Boomer. That was all that mattered now. In the days that followed, Michelle took extra care to show Boomer how much he meant to her, how grateful she was for his courage. He had saved Ava, kept her safe, and in return, Michelle vowed never to take that loyalty for granted again. The bond between Michelle, Ava, and Boomer grew stronger than ever. And in the quiet moments, when the world settled back into its familiar rhythm, Michelle knew one thing for sure. Boomer had given them a gift. He had reminded her what it meant to truly be a family, bound not by blood but by love, loyalty, and trust. And as the sun set over their little house, Michelle looked out the window at the silhouette of Boomer, standing guard once again. She smiled softly, knowing they were safe. Together. Always. The early mornings had always been Michelle's moment of solace. As the sun gently filtered through the windows, casting soft light over the kitchen, she found peace in the routine. A hot cup of coffee, the soothing hum of the coffee machine, and the faint sounds of Ava stirring in her crib. The house felt like a cocoon, a quiet world of warmth and comfort. Michelle often took these moments for granted. They were the backbone of her days, the foundation that held her world together. But today, something felt off. As Michelle moved through the motions of getting ready, brushing her teeth, pulling her hair into a loose ponytail, she couldn't shake the unsettling sensation that lingered in her chest. It was a gnawing feeling, something small but persistent, tugging at her like a thread that wouldn't let go. She tried to push it aside. The day was like any other. She kissed Ava's forehead, whispered a soft goodbye, and gave Boomer a quick pat on the head. "Be good, boy," she murmured as she left for work. But as she stepped out into the cool morning air, she noticed Boomer's gaze following her from the window, his eyes soft yet oddly distant. She paused, locking eyes with him for a brief moment. The unease in her chest deepened. "You'll be fine," Michelle whispered, even though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. Boomer's loyalty had never faltered, and the connection between him and Iva was sacred, unbreakable. But as she drove away, a sliver of doubt crept in. Just a fleeting thought, but enough to make her wonder. Was something wrong? Was today going to be different? When Michelle returned home, the quiet hit her first. The house, which usually felt so alive with the hum of everyday life, was unnervingly still. She called out for Ava, but there was no response. The usual sounds, the soft gurgles of her baby, the rustling of Boomer's paws as he padded around the house, were missing. "Boomer?" Michelle's voice cracked as she stepped into the living room. Her eyes immediately searched for the familiar outline of the German Shepherd. But it was Boomer's stillness that caught her attention. He was standing at the doorway to the nursery, his body tense and unmoving, his fur drenched in something dark. It was blood. "Boomer," Michelle whispered, her voice barely audible. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to comprehend the scene in front of her. The blood. Her mind struggled to process it. Boomer wasn't bleeding. The blood was his, but not from him. She stumbled forward, her legs weak beneath her. Her first instinct was to call for Ava, but her throat tightened. Panic seized her chest. Every step felt heavier, and the silence around her seemed to close in, suffocating her. When she finally reached Boomer, she bent down, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his fur. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. His eyes were wide with a mix of confusion and sorrow, but there was something else there too, something that shook her to her core. Boomer had always been her protector. He was gentle, calm, but now, in the face of this inexplicable horror, he stood there unmoving. He had done something, and Michelle feared what that might be. She couldn't bear the thought of it. Not now. Not after everything. "Ava," she whispered again, this time louder. Her voice felt thin, swallowed by the dark weight of the room. Her heart hammered in her chest, and as she turned to the crib, the silence became unbearable. Her eyes darted around the room. The crib was empty. Ava was gone. In that moment, Michelle's world split in two. Michelle's mind whirled, thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. Her chest felt tight, every breath too shallow, too quick. The air felt heavy as if time itself had stopped. Her legs moved instinctively, each step carrying her further into the panic that had taken root in her heart. "Ava," she called again, her voice trembling as she rushed through the hallway, her mind a blur. Her body moved on its own accord, desperation propelling her forward. She knew she had to find her daughter. She had to. Boomer followed, silent now, his once playful energy replaced with a quiet, almost reverent stillness. The two of them moved together through the house, searching, but Michelle's heart knew what her mind refused to accept. Something had happened. Something had changed. The bathroom door creaked open, and Michelle found her. Ava was huddled on the cold floor, her tiny body shaking as she clung to Boomer's fur. The sight of her daughter, unharmed but terrified, was a relief so deep that Michelle almost collapsed. "Ava," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she rushed to gather her daughter in her arms. "Oh, my baby, I'm here. I'm here." Boomer stood a few feet away, watching them, his eyes full of something Michelle couldn't quite read. He didn't bark or move. He simply watched, as though waiting for something. It took Michelle a few moments to steady herself. She looked down at Ava, holding her close, checking for any signs of harm. Her daughter was fine. Her body was warm, and there were no visible injuries. But there was something unsettling in her eyes, a deep well of fear that Michelle couldn't quite understand. "What happened, sweet girl?" Michelle whispered, brushing a lock of hair from Ava's face. But Ava only clung to her tighter, her small fingers gripping her mother's clothes with a silent plea. Boomer's silence spoke volumes. The dog had been more than a guardian. He had been her protector, and in that moment Michelle realized that he had saved Ava. But from what? And why had Boomer been covered in blood? Michelle spent the rest of the night piecing together what had happened. The shock of the moment still gripped her, but as the hours wore on, she began to think with more clarity. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened before. something that Boomer had sensed long before she ever had. As she reviewed the strange behavior in the days leading up to the event, Boomer's unease, his growling, his sudden bursts of agitation, Michelle realized that Boomer had known. He had known something was wrong, something beyond the ordinary. The blood on him wasn't Ava's. It was the blood of a man who had tried to break into their home, a trespasser. The police report confirmed it. The man was unconscious when they found him, and his intentions were unclear, but it didn't matter. Boomer had stopped him. The revelation hit Michelle hard. She had always known Boomer as a gentle dog, protective but never aggressive. He had never shown any signs of violence. But today, Boomer had crossed a line. He had become a hero, doing what he was bred to do, protect his family, even if it meant fighting to the death. Michelle's heart swelled with gratitude, but also with confusion. Boomer had been covering for her for Ava. The realization sent chills down her spine. She wasn't sure what had happened in that moment, but she knew one thing for certain. Boomer had saved them. And somehow the idea of Boomer, her loyal companion, standing in the gap between them and harm, filled her with both awe and fear. Boomer had never been just a dog. He had always been more. But now, in the aftermath of that day, Michelle realized just how much more. The days after the event passed in a blur. The police came and went, offering reassurances that they were doing everything they could. They questioned Michelle, but she had little to offer. She didn't know why the man had come to their house. She didn't know what had happened before she got home. All she knew was that Boomer had protected Ava. As Michelle sat on the couch, holding Ava close, she stared at Boomer, who lay quietly at her feet. The dog's eyes were soft, almost tired. His usual energy was gone, replaced with a quiet, steadfast presence. Michelle leaned down and ran her fingers through his fur, tears still streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Boomer licked her hand gently, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, Michelle felt like they were connected in a way she hadn't truly understood before. "Thank you for saving her," she said again, her voice breaking. Ava, nestled in her arms, looked up at Boomer with wide eyes. She reached out a tiny hand, her fingers brushing the dog's fur. Boomer gave a soft bark, almost as if to acknowledge Ava's touch. He wagged his tail once, and then laid his head down on the floor. Michelle smiled through her tears, knowing that she was never alone. Not anymore. They were a family, bound by love, loyalty, and a bond that no one could break. As the sun set over their home, Michelle closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of her daughter's body against her own, Boomer's steady presence beside them. It was the calm after the storm, and for the first time in days, Michelle allowed herself to breathe. Everything was going to be okay. They were together, and nothing else mattered. The day unfolded with a calm that, in hindsight, felt too peaceful. The hum of everyday life, the soft clink of coffee cups, the steady rhythm of footsteps on the wooden floor, all felt like a distant memory once Michelle's eyes fell on the empty crib. It was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Boomer had always been a presence, an anchor in the sea of Michelle's busy life, and now his stillness seemed somehow out of place. Ava's laughter, so often the background music to their mornings, was absent. The absence of sound was deafening. Michelle found herself looking toward the nursery door as she slid her shoes off, her instincts stirring. She had spent the early morning hours before work listening to the rhythmic pattern of Ava's sleep, the little noises that came when her daughter drifted between dreams. It was part of the routine, the comforting silence that spoke volumes, until it didn't. She walked toward the nursery almost in slow motion, as though every step took her deeper into the unknown. Boomer remained by the door, his eyes following her every movement, and despite the stillness, she saw a subtle shift in his posture. His body language was uneasy, an unfamiliar tension in his shoulders. Michelle's throat tightened. This wasn't the dog she knew, the one who had always been so loyal, so unyielding. Something was wrong. Her hand gripped the doorframe, and she hesitated for a moment. She needed to trust Boomer, she told herself. But then, with a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Inside, everything looked as it should. The nursery, soft and pastel, still held the scent of baby lotion and freshly laundered clothes. But Boomer was standing there, his body stiff and his fur matted with dark stains. Blood. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her first instinct was to check on Ava, but she couldn't move. Not yet. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for the worst. Ava. Her voice was a breathless whisper, too soft for comfort. Boomer didn't respond, just watched her with those wide, haunted eyes. His breathing was shallow, his body trembling slightly, but he didn't move. The world outside felt far away. For a moment, there was only silence, and then Michelle's gaze finally found the crib empty. Her heart stopped. Panic surged through Michelle's body, her breath coming faster, harder, as she scanned the room for any sign of Ava. The crib was untouched, but her baby was nowhere to be found. She called for Ava again, her voice barely a whisper. Ava. Boomer stood completely still, and the sense of dread in the air thickened. His eyes met hers, as though asking for forgiveness or offering an explanation she couldn't understand. Michelle took a few hesitant steps back toward the crib, her heart racing. What had happened? Where was Ava? The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on her, and the stillness felt suffocating. It was as though time had stopped moving entirely. Michelle's breath hitched as she felt an overwhelming sense of dread coil inside her. She had been too late. The worst possible outcome flashed through her mind. What had happened while she was gone? Was Boomer in distress because of something that had already taken place? Her legs felt weak beneath her as she turned quickly, heading out of the nursery and into the hallway. She had to find Ava. She had to find out what had happened. The clock in the living room ticked louder now, almost mocking her desperate need for answers. "Boomer?" she said softly, almost pleading. "Where is she?" Boomer's tail flicked once, twice, but he didn't move. His eyes followed Michelle, heavy with unspoken words. The silence in the house was unbearable. Everything felt wrong. Her hands shook as she turned and began searching the house, every room feeling like a new version of a nightmare. The nursery, the living room, the kitchen, all empty. No Ava. And then, just as she was about to call out again, a faint sound reached her ears. A soft cry. Her heart leaped into her throat. The faintest sound, barely audible but unmistakable. Ava. Her mind raced as she followed the sound, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. Every corner of the house seemed to close in around her, but still, she moved, guided by the sound of her baby's voice. The bathroom door creaked open, and there, on the cold tiles, lay Ava, huddled on the floor, clutching Boomer's fur for comfort. The sight of her daughter, unharmed but trembling, sent a wave of relief crashing over Michelle. She rushed to her side, her breath coming fast, her heart still pounding. "Ava," Michelle whispered, gathering her daughter in her arms. "Oh, thank God." Boomer, standing a few feet away, watched them, his body still tense but his eyes softening. He had stayed with Ava, kept her safe. The question burned in Michelle's mind. What had happened? Michelle held Ava tightly, her heart still racing as she rocked her baby back and forth. The fear was still thick in her chest, but the sense of relief that Ava was safe was overwhelming. Her little one was unharmed, just shaken, and Michelle clung to her, unable to separate herself from the love she felt. "Boomer, what happened?" she asked softly, looking at her dog. The German shepherd's eyes met hers with an almost knowing gaze. He had done something. He had kept Ava safe, but she couldn't understand how, why. Ava was still crying softly, clutching Michelle as though she'd been separated from her for hours. Michelle's heart ached as she gently wiped her daughter's tears away, trying to reassure her. "It's okay, you're safe now." But something was still unsettled, like a bruise beneath the surface of everything. Boomer's stillness, his quiet obedience, was unnerving. He had been through something too. As Michelle examined Ava more carefully, she couldn't find any signs of injury. There were no scratches, no bruises, no blood. But something about Ava's wide, frightened eyes told a different story. She had been scared. She had felt the terror that Michelle herself had felt. Boomer's presence next to them, unwavering and loyal, felt like the only steady thing in the chaos of the moment. Michelle gently set Ava down on the couch, rubbing her back as she glanced over at Boomer. Her mind was spinning with questions, but she wasn't ready for the answers yet. "What did you do, Boomer?" she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Boomer sat down at her feet, his body still tense, but his gaze never leaving her. He had been the one to protect Ava. He had kept her safe, and though Michelle couldn't yet understand the full extent of what had happened, she knew one thing: Boomer had done something extraordinary. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. What had he been protecting them from? As the hours passed, Michelle found herself replaying the day's events over and over in her mind. Boomer's odd behavior in the past few days, his growling at shadows, his agitated pacing. She had dismissed it as just restlessness or anxiety, but now she wondered if he had been trying to warn her about something. And then it clicked. The blood. The blood on Boomer's fur wasn't his own. It had to belong to someone else, a trespasser. The realization hit her like a cold wave. Someone had entered the house, and Boomer had fought them off. Michelle's mind raced as she thought about the timeline. Had it happened while she was at work? The idea that someone had been in her home, in the nursery with Ava, made her blood run cold. But at least now, she understood why Boomer had been so agitated. He had been protecting Ava from a threat she hadn't seen. The police had arrived not long after Michelle called them, and their questions had been soft, understanding. They had taken Boomer's behavior into account, and after speaking with Michelle and reviewing the scene, they confirmed the worst: a man had broken into the house, intent on causing harm. Boomer had saved them both. Michelle sat in silence for a long while, the weight of everything settling in. The world outside had returned to its routine, but inside, everything had shifted. The dog who had been so loyal, so gentle, had become something more. He had been the barrier between her family and harm. She turned to Boomer, her heart full of gratitude. He had fought for them, and in doing so, he had changed everything. Days passed, but the gravity of what had happened stayed with Michelle. She couldn't shake the image of Boomer standing at the nursery door, bloodied but unbroken, watching over Ava like the protector he had always been. But now Michelle knew Boomer was more than a pet. He was their guardian. As she sat in the living room, Ava playing on the floor with her toys, Michelle reached out to Boomer, scratching behind his ears. His tail wagged slowly, a quiet sign of his contentment. "Thank you," Michelle whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Boomer licked her hand gently, his warm eyes meeting hers with a deep understanding. He didn't need words. He had already done more than anyone could ask. Ava looked up at Boomer, her small hands reaching out to touch his fur. "Boomer," she said softly, a tentative smile crossing her face. The dog lowered his head to her level, nudging her gently with his nose, and Ava giggled. The sound bright and clear in the stillness of the room. It was a small moment, but it meant everything. The bond between them had deepened, transformed. What had begun as a relationship of companionship had now become one of survival, of trust, and of love. Michelle looked out the window. The world outside bathed in the soft light of a fading day. Everything was quiet, calm, but she knew that she would never look at Boomer the same way again. He wasn't just a dog. He was their protector, their hero, and their family. And for the first time since that fateful day, Michelle felt peace settle in her heart. No matter what came next, they would face it together.